Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the epic title that continues to retell the story of one of the most beloved video games of all time. The level of detail and realism included in this reboot has resulted in the successful delivery of an experience that people have been desperate and salivating at the mouth to enjoy for years. However, none of this anticipation would have been possible if it were not for the 1997 original. Functioning as one of my personal favourites of all time, Final Fantasy VII is easily one of the greatest and most influential titles of the 90s. Introducing legions of new fans to the JRPG genre as a whole, Final Fantasy VII felt like the largest, most epic video game that had ever been produced, permanently changing the face of the industry forever. This iconic turn-based affair propelled not just Japanese role-playing games forward, but the Sony PlayStation itself, further helping to cement the hardware as the market leader. However, if you know anything about your gaming history, you will recall that at one point nobody expected this game to come to the PlayStation, as previously every Final Fantasy game had appeared on Nintendo consoles. So when Final Fantasy VII was announced for the PlayStation, the world would be in shock, including even those at Nintendo themselves. So with all of this said, join me today as we revisit gaming's murky past to re-experience the period where we thought Final Fantasy VII would be arriving on a different platform. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Final Fantasy VII for the Nintendo 64. Yeah. The latter portion of the 90s, what a time to be alive. Games were changing at their most rapid pace in history, and titles like Final Fantasy VII would wow consumers with its state-of-the-art polygonal graphics in battles, stunning pre-rendered backgrounds, huge world map to explore, orchestral soundtrack, memorable characters and more. This game was everything. Pair all of this with a story-driven narrative that emotionally invested players to levels never seen in the entertainment medium before, Final Fantasy VII raised the bar in the industry. Amazingly, as grand as this game is, you can buy it today for as little as £4.14. Or, perhaps even more insanely, I can get you the expansive, critically acclaimed remake, complete with the Yuffie DLC, a side story which wasn't even told in the original game, for 58% cheaper than on Steam. To get these games or hundreds of other discounts, feel free to use my Instant Gaming affiliate links via the pinned comment. You get cheap games and it supports this channel. Thanks everyone. Anyway, cheeky plugs aside, 27 years from its original release, Final Fantasy VII and the original PlayStation are as synonymous together as fish and chips, or Phoenix, Arizona and crackheads. This isn't surprising at all when we consider that 12.8 million copies were sold worldwide. The popularity of this game was off the scale, but of course there was a time when its arrival on the PlayStation was yet to be set in stone. Full context behind this story, we first have to look to a gentleman named Hironobu Sakaguchi, a man who in his younger days fell in love with playing wizardry on his Apple II before landing a job at Square in 1986. It's noteworthy that this was the same year the first Dragon Quest game saw a release on the Famicom, a game that allowed Sakaguchi to persuade management at Square to let him produce an RPG of his own. Final Fantasy would come to exist, drawing inspiration from multiple fantasy titles of the period, including The Legend of Zelda and the Ultima series. Both critically and commercially well received, the game would be the beginning of a media empire, with 2 more Final Fantasy games being published on the Famicom and a further 3 mainline games being published on the 16-bit Super Famicom. Directly following these events, a 7th Final Fantasy game on Nintendo hardware at one point felt dead set. In April of 1994, work would commence on a 7th Final Fantasy game. This would take place almost immediately after the release of Final Fantasy VI, with the next installment in the series planned for release unsurprisingly once again on the Super Famicom, which would have functioned as the 4th title made for the system. Working on the previous title, Final Fantasy VI, the most critically acclaimed Final Fantasy so far, Sakaguchi had repositioned himself to function as the producer of the series, granting more active development roles to other people. Due to this switch up, when it came to Final Fantasy VII, Yoshinori Kitase would be handed a solo directorial role, a decision that was made due to the confidence he had instilled in Sakaguchi and Square, co-directing Final Fantasy VI. While at this point the genre was not as mainstream as it would come to be, Final Fantasy VI, known as 3 in North America, would be popular enough in the region that a follow-up entry would be hotly anticipated. This meant that the gaming press of the period would try their best to follow what was going on behind the scenes. In a March 1995 issue of GameFan, they claimed that Final Fantasy VII for the Super Famicom was rumoured to feature Donkey Kong Country style SGI graphics, and the game was going to be released on a 64 megabits cartridge. This, however, is likely not to be true, particularly when we take into account that screenshots of the game during this developmental phase were included in the Final Fantasy 25th Anniversary Ultimania book. Images of this early Super Famicom version of Final Fantasy VII clearly display the game to feature 2D sprites, just like with all earlier iterations from the franchise. In fact, if you look closely at the imagery, they clearly show Locke from Final Fantasy VI being used as a placeholder character. However, if what is out there is to be believed, apparently production of the game would be halted for a while, so that Square could plough resources towards another gaming project. This was the period that another team working at Square was struggling with the production of the ultra-ambitious Chrono Trigger game, the insane collaboration between Square and Dragon Quest creators Enix, featuring artwork from the legendary creator of Dragon Ball, Akira Toriyama. The choice was made to ensure that it was all hands on deck at the company to help make that game the high quality product that it would turn out to be. Following Chrono Trigger being finished, a game that many considered the pinnacle of Super Nintendo JRPGs, those assigned to Final Fantasy VII went back to work on their game. This next development phase would see more ideas experimented with and chucked around, including the consideration to host a story of the title in a New York-like setting. In terms of ideas that were not used, at one point it was planned that the game would include a sorceress character known as Adia. You know, the very same character who ended up being held back for Final Fantasy VIII. Other ideas would be held back and saved for Parasite Eve, and at one point in history the game was intended to revolve around a detective story narrative. This version of Final Fantasy VII would have featured a cold-blooded investigator named Joe, who would have been on a mission in hot pursuit of a group that blew up the city of Midgar. While Joe the investigator was dropped, as you can probably tell, some elements of this version of events were retained. Speaking of investigations, you must be into investigating too, especially if you're watching a gaming history video like this. So if you're finding enjoyment right now, you might be pleased to know I upload 2 videos like this every week, and I plan to cover more elements of Final Fantasy's amazing legacy soon. So hit that subscribe button and ring that bell right now to never miss a video. Thanks! As time progressed and we move into 1995, both the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn are on the market in Japan, and already it is being considered internally at Square whether or not a Nintendo platform would be a suitable home for the next Final Fantasy game. You see, by this point, especially with the Nintendo 64 delayed, the game's director, Yoshinori Kitase, was beginning to become concerned that the Final Fantasy franchise would be left behind if it did not manage to catch up with 3D computer graphics of the time. A graphical style that was very clearly growing in popularity by the day. Due to these changes in consumer tastes, it would lead to the 2D Final Fantasy VII we showed screenshots of earlier being scrapped, and in its place, the early stages of experimenting with a 3D Final Fantasy VII game began. To function as one of the big dogs in this new age, titles needed to be bigger and more ambitious, which required more money being invested and larger teams of people working on projects. The choice would be made to form a team consisting of approximately 120 artists and programmers. Between them, they would experiment using Power Animator and Soft Image 3D software, with a budget allocated to them of more than $30 million. Final Fantasy VII was a project far larger than anything Square had previously worked on. The first big task that would be undertaken by this team was to produce a short experimental tech demo called Final Fantasy SGI, after Silicon Graphics incorporated Onyx workstations, the very same technology that was being implemented and optimized when creating games for the then upcoming Nintendo Ultra 64. Due to this, we would get to witness some rather interesting footage with the Final Fantasy SGI video, showing us a glimpse of what a Final Fantasy game on the Nintendo 64 platform would potentially look like. The demo of this game features polygon-based 3D renderings of characters from Final Fantasy VI, taking part in a real-time battle. Those familiar with a Super Nintendo classic will quickly be able to recognise Tara Branford, Locke Cole, and the ninja known as Shadow in action. As of today, this 5-minute long tech demo now exists as an interesting time capsule, showcasing a pivotal point in history when we were still expecting Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64. During this murky period, while most people expected Final Fantasy VII to appear on Nintendo hardware, behind the scenes, things are in no way clean cut. Even during the era this SGI footage was produced. This was because while SGI hardware was utilised to make this wonderful 3D tech demo, Square had still not committed themselves to the Ultra 64 at all yet. You see, as already mentioned earlier, this was an age in which gaming was going through a tectonic paradigm shift, with many franchises switching from 2D to 3D. For many development houses, including Square, the intimidating realm of 3D gaming was uncharted waters, so they were finding themselves having to navigate extremely carefully to ensure that they stay afloat. Square may have been masters of creating sprite-based 2D JRPGs, but creating one using 3D character models was a much more challenging and risky endeavour. This meant in order to play their cards right, a lot of tough decisions would need to be made correctly. So let's attempt to discuss some of the pros and cons when it comes to picking a side. Final Fantasy VII for the Nintendo 64 certainly had a lot of benefits for Square, including not rocking the boat too much. For starters, the entire Final Fantasy brand had found success exclusively on Nintendo systems, and by this point gaming fans had come to expect Final Fantasy games to appear on such hardware. But just because it seemed like it might be the safest option to stick with, it didn't necessarily mean it was the right one. The first big stumbling block, of course, came when Nintendo opted to stick with cartridge-based media for their Nintendo 64 platform rather than taking advantage of CD-ROMs like both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. This meant that when developing any title for the Nintendo 64, programmers would have to deal with and work around the Nintendo 64 cartridges and their extremely limited storage capacity. Building on this drawback further, the escalating prices of manufacturing cartridges and the cheapness of CDs meant that cartridges seemed like a terrible option moving forward. Reportedly, prior to Square and Nintendo's very public divorce, there had of course already been some behind the scenes disagreements between the two Japanese companies that were resulting in friction. During talks, it is said that Square would outright address some of their concerns with Nintendo and their peculiar choice to stick with the aging cartridge format. Shinichiro Kachitani, vice president of Square USA, told the company regarding the Ultra 64 that they needed a CD-ROM drive in order to be able to support the majority of future JRPGs that would see release going forward, and without one, the Nintendo 64 with its planned features didn't offer up enough bandwidth to showcase large expansive 3D JRPGs. Ignorantly, it seems Nintendo wouldn't budge, despite Kajitani claiming that Square gave Nintendo plenty of good advice. He also adds that when speaking to the president of Nintendo directly, the infamous Yamauchi-san, the leader of the company refused to listen to anything they had to say. It was at this point that Kajitani realised that developing games for the stubborn Nintendo 64 was likely a poor decision going forward, and other options needed more exploration. However, not all hope of making Final Fantasy VII a Nintendo game was quite lost yet. The announcement of the Nintendo 64 disk drive peripheral, which would allow for games with greater storage capacity, looked like there was a bit more potential for Square to stick around. However, there was still a problem. The DD still couldn't match CD-ROMs in terms of storage, and Nintendo had yet to even produce a 64DD development kit for programmers to experiment with. Still, developmental experimentation would persist, but after the prototype changed specifications several times, a real-time version of Final Fantasy VII ended up being discarded during the early testing phase for the 64DD. One particular aspect that made it clear that 64 technology was the wrong technology relates to Final Fantasy's classic Deermoth monster. For the Nintendo 64 testing, a 2,000 strong polygonal model had been created of the famous beast, placing excess strain on the Nintendo console, leading to terrible frame rate as a result. Through some calculations, Square would come to the conclusion that in order to produce the game that they had in mind, Final Fantasy VII would need to be spread across an incredible 30 64 DD discs to even make the vision they had in mind possible. This meant that Square couldn't make a decent 3D role-playing game on the 64 with the data compression methods of the period that were available at their disposal. Hironobu Sakaguchi has made the claim that the game began to become huge in scope due to using a lot of motion data plus CG effects and still images. It turned out to be a mega capacity game, and therefore we had to choose CD-ROM as our media. In other words, we became too aggressive and got ourselves into trouble. Faced with the state of current technology and impressed by the increased storage capacity of CD-ROMs when compared to the Nintendo 64's feeble cartridges, it just seemed like it made sense to shift all Square development projects, including Final Fantasy VII, over to the Sony PlayStation. This meant that all the additional bells and whistles, such as the pre-rendered movies the team desired to implement into the game, would all be entirely possible. Square's jump to work with Sony marked one of the biggest studio jumps in history, with the news being publicly announced in 1996 that all planned future games would be for the PlayStation, with Final Fantasy VII being the most anticipated of them all. Reflecting on the move, a character and battle visual director working at Square, Tetsuya Nomura, brings up that he remembers this day well, commenting, "I remember walking down the hall when Sakaguchi-san stopped me and said, 'Hey, look at this.' He was wearing this jumper jacket and he turned around and showed me the PlayStation logo on the back. I stood there, kind of dumbfounded. I was pretty low on the totem pole at Square back then, so I couldn't really say anything in response. And in any event, even if he had talked to me about it, I was only in a position to nod and agree with him." Final Fantasy VII director Yoshinori Kitase, who we've already mentioned in this tale, recalls that in order to help promote the shift to PlayStation hardware in Japan, Square would place an ad in Shonen Jump magazine, a publication that was circulated to 6 million people per issue. This, paired with some solid TV advertising, established in the region that Final Fantasy VII's home would indeed be the Sony PlayStation. Shinichiro Kajitani, the Square USA Vice President, the man who had already spoken to the Nintendo President, would reveal that it was Sony who approached Square, rather than the other way around, with them asking if they wanted to develop 3D games for their system instead of Nintendo. Hiroshi Kawai, a character programmer at Square Japan, brings up that when comparing the two systems through their extensive testing phase, that they quickly discovered there was more benefits to developing games for the PlayStation beyond just its greater storage capacity. While writing performance applications and comparing how well the two pieces of competing hardware fared against each other, he made discoveries. Part of this process would involve him getting a bunch of 2D sprites bouncing off the screen, and then seeing how many polygons he could get within a 60th of a second. In this regard, the PlayStation trumped the 64, and even without any kind of texturing or any kind of lighting. He adds that the Nintendo 64 offered less than 50% of what would have been achievable with the PlayStation, concluding that there is no way you could have anything close to the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy VII on the 64. Tomiyuki Takechi, President and Chief Officer at Square, in relation to the Sony PlayStation deal, brings up that Sony gave them an offer they could not refuse, one of which was better than they had offered to any other publisher. I guess the Final Fantasy brand, with its amazing sales record in Japan, was just too much for Sony to resist. He states that while he cannot talk about the finer details, basically Sony went very low on the per unit royalties they had to pay, a far more attractive offer than Nintendo would have ever been willing to entertain. Takechi states that this deal would lead to making their relationship with Nintendo very unfriendly at the time, with years passing without the parties talking. Kajitani adds that Square employees were banned from visiting Nintendo's offices for an entire decade, viewing the famous JRPG producer as adversarial. Takechi did feel though that leaving Nintendo was not just best for business for themselves, but better for consumers too, as the success of the Sony PlayStation meant that Nintendo couldn't continue to keep forcing up prices. Going back to Kawai, who advocates that the PlayStation was the superior of the two platforms, he has noted in the past that he likes Mario and Zelda, and the Mario and Zelda Nintendo 64 games are very impressive, but believes that games like them are the extent of what the Nintendo 64 could do, providing another reason why the system's library lacks diversity. Building on his experiences, he mentions the recount he heard at the time from when Square revealed to Nintendo they were no longer doing business with them, and that Nintendo's immediate response was, "If you're leaving us, then never come back." In an old interview online from 2001, Square president Hisashi Suzuki claims that while Nintendo were not that frustrated at the time that Square left, relationships would go completely sour at a later date, after Square leaving had a ricochet effect that would convince many other developers that it was a good idea for them to stop publishing Nintendo games too, including Dragon Quest creators Enix. Shinichiro Kajitani's prediction that the Nintendo 64 wouldn't have an expansive 3D JRPG came true. While accounts may vary from person to person on how much bad blood, if any at all, was involved between Square and Nintendo, Square switching the development of their games to the Sony PlayStation was certainly the right move. The game for the PS1 would sell in record numbers, becoming the best-selling Final Fantasy game in history, and becoming the first mainline Final Fantasy game ever to see release in Europe. Holding its legacy in mind today, it's hard to imagine a smaller, weaker Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64 instead of the behemoth of a title we received. However, if the stars failed to align properly, that could very well have been the future we received. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, then you might want to subscribe and check out my video on this bizarre forgotten Final Fantasy VII fighting game I've covered. Or, if you want content early and want to support this channel in a more personal way, then I'd be very grateful if you backed my show on Patreon. Yeah, cheerio.